I really don't want to do this. Really, there's very little I could possibly say about this game without beating a dead horse. I'll admit, when it was in development, I was as obsessed as any Sonic fan possibly could be. I was swept away by the at the time beautiful graphics and endless hype. When it eventually became apparent that I wouldn't be able to save up enough money to get an Xbox 360, which was the cheapest console this game would be playable on by the time it would come out, I started crying. Please keep in mind, I was a bit younger back then and not nearly as mature as I am now, but if I could go back in time those 5 years, I would smack myself upside the head and knock some sense into myself. Really, really hard. A couple years ago, my bro got a PS3 and I had a bit of moolah to spend, and I happened to find a copy of Sonic the Hedgehog 2006 on a shelf at GameStop. The game had been out for a very long time by then, and it was only $15, so I thought, why not? And I finally got my paws on Sonic 06. Derp. Alright, let's make this quick. First, let's talk about gameplay. The gameplay is buggy as hell. Big surprise. I was able to avoid most of the glitches I've seen other people trip over and got through most of the game without a hitch, but there were still a couple instances where my luck inevitably ran out. The one I remember most vividly was in the Kingdom Valley Lake section, where I had to find 3 keys as Rouge, something like the treasure hunting stages of SA2. At one point I clung to a wall and found myself unable to let go. Oh sure, I was still able to move. I could climb anywhere on that wall I wanted to, but I couldn't touch any walls that were at an even slightly different angle, and I couldn't fly. I spammed the jump button like mad and must have covered every inch of that wall to see if there was a certain spot I could escape from and undo this glitch. I think I might have even let an enemy shoot me to see if getting hit would somehow knock me loose. Eventually I had nowhere left to go and just put Rouge out of my misery by crawling into the water and drowning her. At some point I made contact with that wall again, but that time I was able to let go. I have no idea what's caused that glitch, but it made me never want to play this stage again. And yet here I am recording footage of it. Derp! I have no doubt you've probably already heard about these minefields and seen other people get caught. This is bad. Glitches that happen randomly are bad enough, but at least there's a chance that it won't happen. There should be no need for the player to avoid parts of the level just because the designers got tired. Sonic 06 is just that bad. Even though I did manage to make it through most of the game safely, there were a few other glitches that caught me. I'm pretty good at video games in general, and I rarely find myself caught in a glitch in most games that other people call glitchy, be those games good or bad. And I don't like to blame my death on the game if it could possibly be my fault, but in this game the glitches are so prominent that they're almost unavoidable. If you somehow make it through the entire game without encountering a single glitch, good for you. You must have the snot of angels in your blood. But that is extremely unlikely if only given that this game is so infested with countless glitches that you're bound to bump into one at some point. By technical standards, 06 is very flimsy. Let's also talk about bad camera angles. Back in my Sonic Adventure videos, I said I think it's bullshit when people say that Sonic in 3D is a bad idea because the camera keeps screwing them over. And in most other 3D games, I still think this is crap. But in this particular game, the camera really is bad. Most of the time, it's okay, it really is. But there are many instances where I'll be running down the side of a vertical tunnel or something like that and eventually slow down, stop, and fall the rest of the way down because the camera wouldn't accommodate the direction I was supposed to be running along. This really isn't a problem in most Sonic games I've played, but in this game's case, a lot of things happen that honestly shouldn't. Just about all games in general have a glitch somewhere, but this game has such a huge amount of them, it's just embarrassing. The physics are nothing special. There isn't a lot of fluidity, and though it isn't too hard to get around, the game feels kinda stiff. The game wasn't extremely hard to play or anything like that, but it sure felt forced at times. The level designs are okay, they're standard. Loops, light dash trails, grind rails, nothing surprising, though I will say I hate how Sega gave up altogether on the player's control over anything while grinding aside from jumping off or boosting, making an already iffy game mechanic downright boring. There is also an overwhelming amount of scripted events. A scripted event, for those of you who don't know, is a portion of the game that plays itself and leaves little control to the player, carrying them from one location to another without them having to do anything. Some of these can be avoided, and most of them are short, but they are generally well known for sucking the player in and forcing them along a predetermined path that is out of their control. Since the beginning, there have always been at least a few of these in Sonic games, but as the years go on, Sonic games are having more and more of these crammed into them, and it really shows here. Yes, there is platforming, some of it pretty unique too. Yes, there is some exploration, given that some of these areas are very big, but overall this is not a very satisfying experience, and considering just how many scripted events there are, it really doesn't help that a lot of them are glitchy and will very likely kill you just for the sake of it. You can play as many different characters with their own functions and whatnot, but only a few of them are really fun in their own way. There's a ton of fighting in this game and the characters have their own fighting styles, but they really don't feel all that different. I think the designers did an awesome job with the enemies though. There are many, many different kinds, and most of them really pack a punch. You may wind up surrounded by a dozen at once, and you'll take down hundreds of these guys by the time you've completed the game. And even though the game in general is pretty dull, smashing these robots is pretty satisfying. At least for a while. Sonic is not fun to fight enemies with. You just spam the homing attack endlessly, darting back and forth through a swarm of enemies, occasionally using the bounce bracelet, which really isn't as fun as it was in SA2, on an enemy that won't go down with one hit, or sliding through them like a bowling ball, to make it slightly less repetitive. Really, the homing attack is used like crazy in this game. Sometimes all you have to do is press that one button 30-something times to make it through an action sequence. It's mind-numbingly stupid. Shadow's gameplay is similar, aside from using a vehicle or his chaos powers every now and then. Most of these characters find their own way, but they really don't add much. The only character I actually had fun fighting with was Silver, the new guy. His powers are really cool and add a lot to the fighting. He can pick up ridiculous amounts of debris to hurl at enemies, use their own weapons against them, and even use some enemies' bodies as ammo. This just never got old for me, and it's one of the few gameplay mechanics that didn't feel so stiff. His platforming is pretty iffy, and there were some areas where I got lost because I did the wrong things in the wrong places, but I think they could have made a really cool action brawling game centered entirely around Silver's gameplay. A lot of people complained about Sonic's speed. They think he's too slow. I don't think Sonic needs to blaze through everything constantly, and I normally don't agree with these people, but he does feel kind of stiff here, along with just about everything else. There are some horribly designed dash sections where he'll run like mad and often hurl himself into an abyss because you slightly changed the direction you were running along when you jumped, which throws him off very easily. There is no way to slow down as you're propelled at insane speeds, and it's stupidly easy to be thrown out of whack. They just aren't that fun. When Sonic isn't too slow, he's too fast. The designers seriously failed to find a middle ground like in Sonic Adventure. And here's where the gameplay really pisses me off. It tries so hard to be Sonic Adventure 3. It doesn't even share similarities with Sonic Adventure 2, no, it wants to be like Sonic Adventure 1. Even though it isn't nearly as fluid as Sonic Adventure was, it emulates SA1 like a child idolizing its predecessor and wanting to be just like them, but it fails. There were more than a few things about this game that made me feel like I was playing another Sonic Adventure game, though it felt a bit more like a toned-down rehash rather than a continuation. But even though it was obviously trying, it still fails, and it annoys the hell out of me when I hear people dare to call this game Sonic Adventure 3. I mean, sadly, it's probably the closest thing we're ever gonna get to an SA3, but that doesn't make it nearly as good as SA1. I just don't think it's worthy of being considered an SA3. If there's anything I feel I should commend the level designers for, it's how big the levels are. None of them take terribly long to beat except maybe the last few stages. They're just really big. You're given lots of wide open spaces to roam around in and explore, often being even roomier than the original Sonic Adventure. But they always manage to give you some sense of direction so you don't get lost. There is a lot of depth in some of these designs. Sadly though, they're shot in just about every other possible way. Here's the thing. Making video games takes time. And the best video games are often the ones that are developed for 3 or 4 years. Nintendo practices this a lot, and as a result, a lot of their games just feel more polished. But for some reason, Sega pressured themselves to release this game before they could really finish it. They should have given themselves more time, maybe released it around Christmas or something, but they just had to put it on the shelves exactly at the time of Sonic's 15th anniversary, in the summer. Whatever they were trying to do, they did not completely succeed because they didn't have enough of anything to work with. If the designers had more time to work on this and flesh it out so that it plays just right, maybe it really could have been just what people wanted it to be. But they rushed it, and it turned out a lot buggier and not nearly as fun as Sonic Adventure. Whatever they had back then hasn't carried over to this game. Now for the story. There are a lot of things that bring the story down. First of all, this game adopts a fairly realistic setting, in a world very much like our own. I didn't want to repeat myself, but as I said back in Essay 2, Sonic and humans just don't mix. Sonic is unique and unpretentious. He's a cutesy little woodland critter who defends nature and saves other cutesy little woodland critters. This isn't childish, it's what makes Sonic special. That's all he is and all he needs to be. Whether or not you're capable of taking this seriously simply depends on what kind of person you are. Also, the world around him should reflect him. No matter how good the graphics are, the environment should be cartoony and dreamlike. And though some of these environments are quite pretty, most of them are not fitting for a Sonic game. The change in tone affects everything, including the stage names. In the hub worlds, everywhere you look, you see humans that look very much like real people. This is a bad thing. A good Sonic game should not try to be realistic. It's the embodiment of escapism. There is nothing wrong with it being cute and cartoony. Some delude themselves into thinking Sonic in the real world is somehow a unique take on the franchise that makes it more interesting and mature. I think this makes it more generic and bland. And even though some of these places you see still have something of a fantasy feel, this game in general tries to be disturbingly realistic. Another thing that makes this game feel silly is that it tries to be as overly dramatic as possible. I've seen a lot of things in my life on the internet, and I think the best stories in the world, the most powerful, were the few that weren't trying to be dramatic. Oh, there's nothing wrong with drama as long as it's genuine and complements the story, but there are some cases where they go too far and they have too little to work with. Sonic 06 is like that. It pretends to be more epic than it really is. It doesn't take it easy and let things flow naturally. A good story doesn't need to be overblown and frilly like this if it already has substance. Oh sure, there are a few things in this story that I like, but in general it's very pretentious. The older Sonic games weren't afraid of being cute. They weren't so insecure of being viewed as just a kid's game, and didn't take themselves seriously any more than they needed, so anytime something even a little bit dramatic did happen, it was more genuinely powerful. There actually are a few scenes that were intended to be cute, but even then they are trying too hard. Instead of accomplishing a lot and doing so little, it talks too much and hardly says anything that makes sense. Let's talk about characters. Elise is an okay character, I guess. I think it's interesting that she cannot cry without destroying the universe, and she needs to be strong and hold all that turmoil in, and I think it was intriguing that she was willing to destroy herself if it would prevent Eggman from getting his fat paws on her power. But any redeemable qualities she has are insignificant when you consider her relationship with Sonic. I mean, if they were friends who share a deep connection that has nothing to do with physical attraction, I guess that would be tolerable. But she freaking loves him! The scene where she and Amy are talking about their crushes and don't realize that they're talking about the same guy would probably work for anything else, but it is so bad for anything Sonic-related. I'm not going to say she's perverted or crazy or anything like that, but this sounds like a very bad fanfic rather than a good Sonic game. That scene where she kisses him to bring him back to life? Ugh, it should have been Amy. Just look at these two. Love is truly blind. Now let's talk about Silver, the new guy. His story really isn't that bad, well, at least not certain things in it. It's a journey of self-discovery and struggling to determine what is really wrong or right and who you should trust and what, if anything, is really worth fighting for and learning to appreciate the few things you have in this world because nothing lasts forever. I get that. I even like it when Blaze says she likes Silver because he's naive, but the execution is still sloppy, and Silver himself would have been better off in a completely different game. He's not even really a bad character, but he isn't a good character, he's just ordinary. Now for Mephiles! I think he's an okay villain, being able to go anywhere and anyone he wants to, manipulating the characters in extremely elaborate ways, and I love that he actually managed to kill Sonic. Holy crap! But the way he killed Sonic was totally lame, and he does a lot of things that seem quite unnecessary, if anything. Apparently the guys who wrote this didn't get this whole time travel thing. It's implied that Mephiles can only be in one place at one time, so if he can't be found in the future, it's because he's too busy playing in the past, and vice versa. If you want to find Mephiles, by traveling through time with Chaos Control, you can only find him in a certain part of the timeline where he currently is. This does not make any sense. Time is not space. It's not like he can only occupy one point in time, and going to any other point in time somehow erases his being at any other point in time. If he can travel through time, he could be anywhere, at any given time. He could be in all places, at all times. If he meets you in the future, that doesn't stop him from having already made mischief in countless other points in time just because you see him in person in the one place and time that you perceive as the here and now. Mephiles can be anywhere and everywhere at once. There are no restrictions, but considering all the trouble he goes through, you'd think there was. The only story I found very engaging was that of Shadow, which is weird. Sonic's story or Silver's stories honestly aren't that interesting, but this game might as well be Shadow the Hedgehog 2. It's all about him. His battles with Mephiles take up a lot more of the story than anything else, and the time travel stories make a bit more sense in his case. There are just a lot more things I loved about this story mode than the other two. I think it's awesome that Omega just sat still in one spot for centuries and eventually woke up to help Shadow in the future, though that kind of thing does conflict with his presence anywhere else. I also like that Shadow sealed Mephiles in the past, but later on, his slightly younger, unaware self accidentally released Mephiles years after his future self sealed the demon. Though this game's story in general is very boring, this is good storytelling. Shadow, Rouge, and Omega are not very interesting on their own, but they are pretty good characters when they're together, and themes like being loyal and loving your true friends regardless of what the rest of the world thinks, if anything, make a much more compelling story than anything else in this game. They complement each other. They need each other more than anyone else does. Team Dark should start their own franchise that is separate from Sonic altogether. They just don't belong here. I also think it was clever that the final boss battle, according to the story, takes place across the whole timeline, and Shadow stands for the past, Silver stands for the future, and Sonic stands for the present. I hate this game's voice acting. Shadow sounds like he has asthma. I have asthma, so I know what I'm talking about. Silver is generic. Sonic is bland. Almost everyone emphasizes everything obnoxiously like this. Enough said. The music is pretty good, but not great. See, I'm not one of those guys who will fall for anything that has orchestral music in it. I think it's silly and pretentious when the composers make a point of adding classical sounding music to a game as if that somehow makes it better than if it had any other kind of music. I hear lots of video game soundtracks that feature orchestral music not because it's fitting for the game, but as if it's so special it can make any boring game feel epic. But putting orchestral music in a game that doesn't need orchestral music because orchestral music isn't fitting for the game, but they put it there simply for the sake of having orchestral music at all, makes it feel generic and overused for all the wrong reasons. This is one of those games that features orchestral as if it's more tasteful than any other Sonic music. I don't think it's very fitting for a Sonic game, and though there were a few tunes I enjoyed, such as Wishing Upon the Emeralds and the second phase of the final boss and Mephiles' second phase, I honestly think that this music is bland. Not all of it, but a lot of it. Don't bother defending your favorite tracks, because chances are I'm not talking about them. I've heard much better classical music that wasn't thrown into a game simply for the sake of sounding more elegant or elevated than that silly rock music. As for the rest of the music, I hear a lot of and it gets really old. Any rock featured in this game has much less kick or joy than that of Sonic Adventure, and though there are some tunes I enjoyed, some of it was just tepid. Sonic 06 was a disaster. I wanted to enjoy it. I wanted it to be good. I really did. I couldn't imagine the possibility of a Sonic game being so bad. But anything to enjoy in this game is easily drowned out by everything bad about it. It probably had the potential to become something that could have been great, but what we got on the shelves was a mess. I managed to beat it within a few days, but it was more of an ordeal than a good time, and the almost constant loading screens didn't help at all. When this came out, I, along with many others, were certain that this would be the last main Sonic game. I mean, come on, the whole universe was destroyed and Sonic died. How are they supposed to top that? Why did the few good things in this game have to be wasted on such a piece of crap? Thank Primus there was that massive retcon at the end that undid everything in this game. I was stupid for bothering to play this game after hearing so much about it over the years and seeing other people suffer. And if you play it after watching me, after all that, you're even dumber than I am. Since this game was so hated, I didn't think Sega would ever scrounge up enough yen to give it another go. But they had some left over from Sonic Rush for the DS. After a while, they made Sonic Rivals for the PSP, and then Sonic Rider Zero Gravity for the PS2. And slowly, they climbed back up until they had enough to try again with Sonic Unleashed for the PS3, which a lot of people enjoyed for all the wrong reasons. Toodles!
Time to worry, then none, right?
Nice smile.